Thank you for the very nice introduction. You're mentioning Bernard Lewis, and my service as the Kissinger Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations brought a story to mind, which is that there was a meeting in Philadelphia, a kind of celebration of Bernard Lewis, and Henry Kissinger had come down and was speaking, and I was, by a sort of bizarre stroke, I was asked to speak immediately after Kissinger. And so when I got up, I said, listen, as I think about the difference between Kissinger and the Kissinger Fellow, I'm reminded of a line of Mark Twain's when he talks about the difference between the lightning and the lightning bug. And I have to say, from that day to this, Henry Kissinger and I have been good friends. So if you wish to join the circle of Henry's friends, there's a way to do it. Anyway, it's great to be here in an organization that my friend Fuad Ajami and the great scholar Bernard Lewis were involved in. It's a wonderful organization. I'm glad you're continuing the work and continuing to bring the fresh perspectives that you are to this topic. And I know that for many of you, this can sometimes be a very difficult vocation in a time when it's not necessarily, your approach is not necessarily the most fashionable one there. And I just salute you. That again reminds me of a thing that once happened when I was speaking. I'd given a talk and was coming down from the podium, and this woman came up to me and said, oh, she said, Professor Mead, I just want to tell you what a great speech that was. I so admire your courage. And I thought, oh no, what did I just say? But you guys show courage all the time. And congratulations on it, and long may you continue to do it. I was asked to talk about a book that I published last year on the U.S.-Israel relationship. And I'm happy to do that, the Ark of a Covenant. I feel like some of my predictions anyway were prescient. One is that the subject of Israel and the Middle East will never go away in American politics and policy. That, I think, has been borne out. But in general, in the book, I tried to avoid, as far as possible, making policy recommendations. That is the curse of just about every book in this field. That publishers often insist, especially if you're at a think tank, but anywhere, publishers insist on recommendations, not realize, I hope all of us will have a slightly longer shelf life for our predictions than Jake Sullivan did with his recent Foreign Affairs article. But nevertheless, no matter how prescient you are, after a couple of years, your recommendations deeply grounded in the reality of August 2022 will begin to lose some of their salience by August 2024. And if you're writing an academic book, it may well not come out until August 2025 or 26. Putting a lot of recommendations in a book is a sure way both to make enemies and kill your book. Advice to everyone here. What I tried to do instead was to look at some of the ways on both sides of the issue, all sides of the issue, discussion of the history of American policy vis-a-vis Israel is wrapped in myth and very hard to penetrate to an accurate narrative. And there's a narrative, there's a pro-Zionist narrative that if any of you grew up going to Jewish summer camps in day school, you probably heard, which is, it's the spring of 1948, and nobody knows what's going to become of Israel. The fate hangs in the balance. Harry Truman is refusing to see anybody from the Jewish community. And Israel, its fate is hanging. But then little Eddie Jacobson, Truman's boyhood friend, a businessman from Missouri, comes in and says, like Queen Esther in the Bible, goes right into the moody Gentile ruler and says, save my people. And Truman basically says, and this much is historical, all right, you bald-headed son of a bitch, you win, I'll see him, and went on to see Chaim Weizmann, all right? But, you know, and that's a beautiful story, and as it's told in the American Jewish community often, and therefore Israel was saved, and it shows the littlest Jew from the littlest city in America can stand up and be a historic. That, by the way, is probably true, but what isn't true is that Eddie Jacobson's meeting with Truman had any visible impact on American policy. Truman's State Department had receded from U.S. support for the partition resolution and was actively trying to broker a delay of Jewish independence in Palestine, and would continue to do this right up until the moment when, you know, the last thing Ben-Gurion's cabinet does before declaring independence is they vote to reject Harry Truman's final plea that they delay independence. So Israel began as it intended to continue by ignoring American advice when it thought that was not the right advice to take. But this is a story, you see, that both sort of pro-Israel and anti-Israel people batten on for this, you know, for different reasons. For the anti-Israel people, this is a story of how the insane, omnipotent, monolithic lobbying of the American Jewish community forced a weak Harry Truman to override the advice of the State Department, the CIA, and the Pentagon, and go on this crazy policy venture. So both sides take a misunderstood historical fact and use it as a kind of a foundation stone for all kinds of further narratives and disputes. And the public understanding of what happened keeps drifting farther and farther away from the actual historical record. Now, as far as I can tell, American policy toward Israel, actually it's a bit like the Wizard of Oz. Hopefully everyone here, you know, these days we don't have many cultural references that we can all use. I think I'm still safe with the Wizard of Oz. But you have the great and powerful wizard and the big booming and the flashing and the smoke of the noise, and then there's, you know, the little man behind the curtain. And I would say that the political salience of Israel policy, the political disputes around it, the uses of Israel policy by presidents for political signaling are very much like that sort of, you know, the Wizard of Oz, blah, 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 the big noise and so on, while the actual policy is generally very much like that little man behind the curtain. That is, the policy has almost always been a good deal less ambitious than the rhetoric, and the policy, frankly, has been pretty realist. That is to say, realist in a certain sense. If you understand what each successive American administration has thought the American interest was, what the role of the Middle East played in the American global interest as they saw it, and what role a relationship with Israel might or might not play in America's Middle East strategy, if you work those things through, you come pretty much, you will not be surprised by many things that have happened in U.S.-Israel relations between 1948 and now. It's a pretty good touchstone. Presidents have not always been right about what the national interest was, and their policies toward Israel have not always had the consequences, the effects that they hoped they would have, but this is generally speaking what they were trying to do. And the point I try to make in my book is that's pretty much the way we make policy for all countries. You know, we ask, if we think about our German policy, we say, well, what are we trying to do globally? What's the role of Europe in that global policy, and what's the role of Germany in our European policy? If you kind of follow that line of inquiry, you will pretty much get, it'll be easy to understand the currents of U.S.-German relations in a particular administration. Again, these visions of the interests change in the U.S. And so we have never been, the rhetoric is very different. I'll get to that in a minute. But if you think about the sort of stages of American policy toward Israel from 48, when we thought up until the Yom Kippur War, basically, the feeling was that our goal in the Middle East was to keep the Soviet Union out of the Middle East and, if possible, enlist as many of the Arab countries as possible on the American side in the Cold War. I'm grossly oversimplifying. And Egypt, at least through the Kennedy administration, was seen as the key to that. We had much more of an Egypt-focused American policy under Eisenhower and most of the Kennedy administration than we had an Israel policy. We gave more aid to Egypt. We paid a lot more attention to what Egypt wanted us to do. And in 1956, obviously, we sided with Egypt against both Israel, France, and Britain in the Suez crisis. And you'll find, I'm sure those of you who teach know this, your students all think America has always been pro-Israel, and that the alliance that we have now, we've always had, this has never changed. They have no idea that Israel won the '67 war essentially without U.S. weapons, and that it was the French, not the Americans, who helped the Israelis get the nuclear weapons. And President Kennedy's biggest goal in his Israel policy was to stop the Israeli nuclear program. In fact, the first time the phrase special relationship was used by an American president to describe U.S.-Israel relationship was when President Kennedy was trying to talk the Israelis into giving up their nuclear program because the United States would take care of their defense needs if they did that. And Ben-Gurion wanted nothing to do with it, and perhaps some would say he was wise, some would say he wasn't wise, but it was that's consistent with the Israeli view of this relationship. Anyway, and as I say in the book, by the way, Stalin had much more to do with the rise of an independent Jewish state than Truman, at a time when Truman was keeping up an arms embargo on Israel, which hugely favored the Arabs, who essentially at this time were clients of the British and being armed and trained by the British. It was Stalin who was sending arms to the Jews in Palestine with the goal of breaking the British Empire in the Middle East. And he actually did pretty well with this. And driving a wedge between the U.S. and Britain, also reasonably successful. And a number of other things. Plus, it enabled the Czechs, the Czechoslovakian Communist Party, to cement its power and reject Marshall Plan aid. Stalin is supposed to have said to the Czechs at one point, selling these arms to the Jews, that's your Marshall Plan. So shut up. And that, again, would have been in direct violation of American policy, which would have been trying to stop the consolidation of communist rule in Czechoslovakia. I didn't write about this in the book, but if somebody out there is looking for something to write about, I think you could find that the deep State Department and CIA dislike of Israel, which becomes always had been somewhat strong, but in the 50s is super strong, has a lot to do with when they started figuring this out. And also their suspicions of the American Jewish community and dual loyalty related to people helping get hard currency to Israel that would ultimately go to Czechoslovakia in this. But what I'm saying is this history does not support either Zionist myths, origin myths, or anti-Zionist origin myths. Certainly doesn't support the idea that a united American Jewish community was sort of playing the American political system like puppets on a string. And I would suggest to all of you that we should try to be getting a richer historical understanding of this relationship out there. Well, I should probably say just a little bit here about the, why is the discussion of the U.S.-Israel relationship so very, very far from the reality? That is, why do we have so much sentimentality? Why do we attribute so much sentimentality to American policy? Why do some people assume that, it's American Jews and American evangelicals who between them are foisting a certain policy on them? Why is Israel so salient, this very small state, which is not a large American trading partner, which is not a particularly large market for anything? Why is Israel, which is surrounded by much larger countries, some of whom we have much more important economic relations with, why is Israel so salient? And here I think we do come to a reality that presidents know that people who don't follow foreign policy follow Israel. That there are tens of millions. I've been spending a lot of time in India lately, so I'll say there are crores of Americans who are deeply interested in the U.S.-Israel relationship, have very strong views about the kind of relationship they want, and so pay a lot of attention. And if you're a president and you want to communicate with your followers and you want to stir up the loyalty of your people, all right, or you want to indicate, you want to signal where you stand politically, Israel policy is terrific. Let's think of during the peace process. Peace process, by the way, has now gone on longer than the 30 Years' War, and I suspect is no closer to a result. But, suppose you're a Democratic president. Suppose you're Joe Biden today, all right? And you're running for re-election and you want to figure out how to balance it. Now, for Biden, after October 7th, it's been difficult. But basically, if you want to make the left happy with you, say something like, Palestinian lives matter and Palestinians should live in dignity and peace like Israelis. And the left wing of your party goes, oh, he's finally understood. We're moving the needle. We're gaining something. He's listening, all right? And then on the other hand, if you think, I really need to shore up my right flank, you say, Israel has the right to defend itself. And everybody in the center and right goes, oh, finally, right? He's getting it. Now, neither of those statements calls for you to spend one penny of money to send a single American troop or ship to any point on the planet, or in fact to take any concrete action at all. All right? So, with a purely symbolic speech, you can change the political picture. Not only can you change it at home, but you can change things abroad too. Certainly for the whole, since Oslo and beyond, it's been sort of clear to everybody that the only country that could get Israel to make any concessions to the Palestinians is the United States. The Israelis are happy to have everyone think that because it sort of limits, it makes America look strong, which Americans appreciate. It limits the number of people screaming at them about different things. It sort of allows them to focus. For the Americans, it's perfect. Because if you're an Arab ruler And your people, for some reason, as now, say over Gaza, are just furious about something that is happening in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. All right, you can say, I'm going to Washington and I'm going to tell the President of the United States what needs to be done. Or as we recently saw, 2 Arab foreign ministers could share a podium with Secretary Blinken and make the point they want a stronger support from the United States. Again, this costs you nothing. Right? But it's a way of managing a problem for you. And again, from the standpoint of the United States, if the president has decided, you know, we really need to smooth over our relations with Saudi Arabia, you know, I called him a pariah, and that's not really worked out as well as I hoped, and we need to make things better. Okay, well, one thing you can do is like give him a hero's role in some like verbal drama about the Middle East, you know. MBS has, you know, after speaking with MBS, the American Secretary of State calls for a humanitarian pause in Gaza. All right, again, this costs you nothing, but it is a way of servicing your relationships in the Middle East. So, because these relationships, in a sense, because the symbolism and emotional charge around these relationships is so very, very high, this relationship comes in for much more political signaling and theater. That's why the little man behind the curtain wants the great and terrible Oz show to be going on. And actually maintaining that show is of itself an American interest, as many presidents would see it, because now the politics of the region of the world that produces more oil than any other is entirely riveted into this drama of only the Americans can get the Israelis to do anything about the Palestinians. And so America becomes central to the politics of the Middle East. And we become the focus of different Arab groups. We become the focus of the Israelis, but also the Europeans. You know, if the Europeans want to make an impression, they know that no one in the Middle East listens to them, right? All right, but also we listen to them. So again, if the Europeans are hoping to have an impact on the Middle East, all roads lead to Washington. And I would suggest that if you're the President of the United States or the Secretary of State, that's kind of okay. Now, there are moments, as now, when it really puts you on the hot seat, but again, you can see the President and Secretary Blinken approaching this crisis in some of the same ways they do others, which is the U.S. is going to be more pro-Israel than any other great power, but much less pro-Israel and demonstrably less pro-Israel in a couple of strategically chosen issues or venues where we can just like show not enough difference to win over the Arab street to the extent that there is an Arab street. Of course, there are many, and they all think very different things, but nevertheless. All right, but enough to give our friends in Europe and in the Arab world enough wiggle room so that they're not faced with the choice of throwing over their relationship with us in order to stay at least in the neighborhood of public opinion in their own countries. So it's a highly developed system of perception management that does not actually have very much impact most of the time on what happens on the ground. Is it just? Not really. Is it wise? Sometimes it's not. Do we always do it well? No, we sometimes mess it up. You know, when you have a delicate balance, every now and then you're going to get it wrong. There's no way not to. But it has served the American interest reasonably well in the 50 years since Kissinger and Nixon moved toward a new kind of relationship with Israel. Again, not out of some unique sympathy with the Jewish state, but as part of a broader move to consolidate the American position in a Middle East that, with the oil shocks, Soviet Union attaining nuclear parity and moving into the Mediterranean, had become an extremely important part of the world for the United States. So, we have an interest-based policy and a values-based polity. This is not just the case with our Israel policy. It's the case of a number of American focuses of American policy around the world. And so I came, I think, in the end to the conclusion that American policy toward Israel is like American policy toward every other country on earth, only more so. And that is as close as a conclusion as I've been able to reach. Now, I'd be happy to take questions, comments, denunciations, whatever, orders for my immediate cancellation, whatever else you have in mind.